The woman who stepped off the 315 from Denver on the third day was not the woman Hugh Lawson had been waiting for. He knew at the moment her boot touched the platform. The wrong boot, too fine and city polished, the leather barely broken in. He had memorized the description in the letter. Brown hair, medium height, traveling with one trunk and a blue hat box. This woman had dark auburn hair that caught the afternoon sun like a struck match. She carried no trunk at all, and what she held pressed to her chest was not a hat box, but a leather satchel so battered it looked like it had survived a war. She was tall, almost uncomfortably so, the kind of tall that made men shift their weight and women narrow their eyes. And her face, Hugh would spend months afterward trying to explain her face to himself, and he would always fail. It was not beautiful in the soft, painted way that the illustrated magazines from back east celebrated. It was something fiercer than that. It was the face of a woman who had made a decision and walked through fire to keep it. Hugh was standing at the far end of the platform with his hat in his hands, because his mother had raised him with enough manners to at least do that. He had been standing in that same position, more or less, for 3 days. The station master, a round-bellied man named Elias Cork, had stopped offering him sympathy somewhere around the end of the second day, and had moved on to simply leaving a tin cup of coffee on the post beside the bench without comment. Hugh had drunk every cup. His jaw was set in the particular way that men set their jaws when they are choosing not to feel something they are, in fact, feeling very deeply. The woman with the auburn hair stepped clear of the other passengers, a traveling salesman and his wife, a young couple who could not stop touching each other's hands, and she looked up and down the platform with the focused attention of someone searching. Not the dreamy look of a visitor arriving somewhere new, the sharp, calibrated scan of someone who needed to know exactly where the exits were. Her eyes landed on Hugh. He did not look away in time. She crossed the platform to him in 7 steps, which he counted without meaning to, and she said, "You look like a man who has been waiting a very long time." Hugh opened his mouth, closed it, said, 3 days. She absorbed that. "For me?" "No," he said. And then, because the honest truth had a way of arriving late but arriving hard, he added, "For someone else. She never came." The woman studied him for a moment with those dark, unreadable eyes. Then she said, "My name is Virginia Brooks. I am stranded in your town because the man who was supposed to meet me is apparently not here either." She glanced around Perdition Creek's single main street with the expression of someone updating their assessment of a very bad situation. "I wonder," she said, "if you could point me toward the hotel." Hugh looked at her for one long second. Something shifted in him. He could not have named it then. He would not be able to name it for months. "There is no hotel," he said, "but there is a boarding house. I will take you there." He had waited 3 days for a woman who never came, and then the woman who changed him forever stepped off the train. To understand what those 3 days meant, and why Hugh Lawson was standing at that station at all with his hat in his hands, and 3 days of stubble on his jaw, and a look in his eyes that the people of Perdition Creek would later describe as a man carrying something heavy he won't put down. You have to go back 6 weeks, to the letter. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, which Hugh always remembered because Tuesdays were his days to ride the north fence line, and he had been covered in red Colorado dust and smelling like horse and honest labor when Emmett Gale, who ran the general store and served as unofficial postmaster, had flagged him down in the street and pressed the envelope into his hand with an expression of barely contained curiosity. The letter was from a matrimonial agency in St. Louis, Missouri. This was not, in 1882, an unusual thing. The West had no shortage of men and a considerable shortage of women, and the agencies back east had built tidy little businesses out of the arithmetic of that imbalance. Hugh had written to the agency 4 months prior, at the insistence of his friend and neighboring rancher Dale Whitmore, who had himself found a wife through such an arrangement 2 years earlier and had been insufferably contented about it ever since. Hugh had written the letter with the particular discomfort of a man who knew how to brand cattle and fix a broken axle, and survive 3 days in the mountains without provisions, but who was completely lost when it came to the composition of a personal advertisement. He had described himself honestly: 31 years old, 6 feet 2 inches, owner of a working cattle ranch outside Perdition Creek, Colorado, no family remaining, non-drinking on weekdays, possessing of a house that was structurally sound but in need of a woman's attention. He had added, after staring at the page for 10 minutes, that he was not cruel and did not intend to become so. He had thought this was a low bar to clear. The agency had apparently disagreed and had responded enthusiastically. The woman selected for him was named Clara Hobbs of St. Louis, 26 years old, quiet temperament, experienced in domestic arts. The letter from the agency described her with the detached precision of a livestock catalog, which made Hugh vaguely uncomfortable but which he had pushed aside in favor of the practical mathematics of the situation. He was 31. He had built the ranch alone, and it was a good ranch with good land and a future, but a future felt different when you faced it every morning over a cold stove in an empty house. He had written to Clara Hobbs. She had written back. The letters were careful, polite, two strangers cautiously circling each other through paper. She had told him she liked to read. He had told her about the mountains. She had asked if there were flowers in Colorado. He had said yes, in the spring there were. Something had felt possible, and then she did not come. The first train, no Clara Hobbs. Hugh had assumed a delay. He had ridden back to the ranch, fed the horses, come back the next morning. The second train, no Clara Hobbs. He had felt the first thread of something cold then, but he had dismissed it. Trains were unreliable. Stage connections missed. Women traveling alone faced complications. The third train, still no Clara Hobbs. And then Virginia Brooks. The boarding house was run by a widow named Martha Holt, who was 63 years old, had buried 2 husbands, and had an opinion about everything and a willingness to share it that Hugh had always found exhausting and now found oddly comforting. Martha looked Virginia Brooks up and down in the doorway with the assessing eye of a woman who has seen every type of traveler and sorted them into categories before the second breath, and then she stood aside and said, "Come in then. Supper is at 6. Hugh carried Virginia's satchel inside. She had allowed this with a look that said she was permitting it rather than requiring it, which was a distinction he noticed. And then he stood in the hallway of Martha's boarding house and realized he did not have a reason to stay but was not ready to leave. "Thank you," Virginia said. She said it like she meant it but was not used to needing to say it. "The man who was supposed to meet you," Hugh said. "Do you know where he went?" Something passed across her face then, something quick and controlled, the way a person's expression shifts when they are deciding how much of the truth to release. "I know exactly where he went," she said. "He chose not to come." Hugh did not push. He had his own version of that same story. He rode back to the ranch as the sun was going down behind the mountains, turning the sky the particular shade of orange-purple that existed, he was certain, nowhere else on earth. He unsaddled his horse, brushed her down, went inside, and stood in the kitchen for a long time without lighting the lamp. In the morning he went back to town. He told himself it was for supplies. He needed flour. Emmett Gale could confirm this. But he also went to the boarding house, and he went in the late morning when he knew Martha Holt would be hanging laundry, and he found Virginia Brooks sitting on the porch with a book open in her lap and a cup of tea at her elbow, reading with the complete absorption of a person for whom reading was not a hobby but a necessity. She looked up when his boots sounded on the steps. "You came back," she said, not accusatory, just noticing. "I need flour," Hugh said. She looked at his empty hands. Then back at his face. "Of course you do," she said, and there was something in it, the smallest ghost of amusement, that unlocked something in his chest he had not known was locked. He sat down on the steps without being invited. Virginia went back to her book. The morning went on around them. The street sounds of a small western town, a wagon, a horse, the distant sound of Emmett's voice raised in argument about credit, and somehow the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had both arrived somewhere they had not planned to be and were each working out what to do about that separately, but at the same time. After a while he said, "Where were you coming from?" "Philadelphia," she said, without looking up from the page. He processed that. Philadelphia was about as far from Perdition Creek, Colorado as a person could get while remaining on the same continent. "Long way to travel to be left standing," he said. She turned a page. "He was not a good man," she said. "I learned that slightly too late and considerably too far from home." Hugh looked at his boots. "What will you do?" "I have not decided yet," Virginia said, and she said it with such simple directness, such absence of panic or self-pity, that he found himself looking at her sideways, the way you look at something you want to examine closely but do not want to be caught examining. She had been engaged. She told him over the following days, in the careful, incremental way that she released information, never all at once, never under pressure, but steadily, when she had decided to. His name was Robert Aldridge. He had met her in Philadelphia when she was 24, and he was establishing himself as a businessman with interests in the cattle trade. He had been charming and well-dressed, and had spoken about Colorado with the authority of a man who had been there, when in fact he had never been west of the Ohio River in his life. The engagement had lasted a year. The wedding was planned for June of 1882. In March, Virginia had discovered, through a combination of her own intelligence and a conversation she was not supposed to overhear, that Robert Aldridge's business interests in Colorado were not cattle at all but land, specifically land that he intended to acquire through means that were not legal, using money that was not his, from investors who did not know what they were actually funding. She had confronted him. He had not denied it. He had told her, with the calm of a man who has never had to account for himself to anyone, that she would marry him as planned and she would not mention what she had heard to anyone, because if she did, he would ensure that her family was implicated in the scheme as well. Her father ran a small printing business. The implication was enough. Virginia had spent 3 weeks appearing to comply. She had packed quietly. She had transferred what small savings she had accumulated from a teacher's salary. She had taught school for 2 years, into the kind of practical traveling money that could not be traced. And then, on a Tuesday morning when Robert Aldridge thought she was attending a fitting for her wedding dress, she had boarded a train heading west, with no plan beyond getting far enough away that his threats became logistically impossible to execute. She had gotten as far as Perdition Creek, Colorado, which was, as she told Hugh one afternoon with the dry precision that he was beginning to identify as her particular form of humor, as far west as a woman can go on the money I had. Hugh listened to this story across 3 days of conversation on the porch, at Martha's supper table, on one occasion while she accompanied him to Emmett's store, and he actually did buy flour, which he felt vindicated the earlier claim, and with each piece of it, he understood more and more clearly that Virginia Brooks was not a woman who had ended up in his town by accident. She was a woman who had made a series of deliberate choices, each one under pressure, each one requiring a clarity and courage that most people he knew, including himself, would not have managed. He said this to her on the 4th day, and she looked at him with the direct, unsettling attention that he was learning to expect from her. "You waited 3 days at a train station for a woman who wrote you letters," she said. "That is not nothing either." He had not told her about Clara Hobbs directly, but of course Martha Holt had, because Martha Holt told everything to everyone and she had clearly decided that the information was relevant. "Different thing," Hugh said. "Is it?" Virginia said. He did not have an answer for that, and they both knew it. On the 5th day, a telegram arrived at Emmett Gale's store addressed to a Miss V. Brooks, Perdition Creek, Colorado. Hugh was not there when it arrived. He heard about it from Martha, who heard about it from Emmett, which was the standard information distribution mechanism for a town that had no newspaper. The telegram said, "Your father questioned stop ALDRIDGE looking for you stop do not return stop stay where you are stop ELEANOR." Eleanor was her younger sister in Philadelphia. Virginia had told Hugh about Eleanor, 22 years old, sharper than people expected, with a talent for moving through the world without being noticed, which was a skill Virginia had always admired and never fully possessed herself. The telegram was short, but it was also, Virginia told Hugh when she found him at the livery stable where he was paying for his horse's board, a complete communication. "Aldridge knows I left," she said. She was holding the telegram but not looking at it. She had already absorbed it. "And he is looking for me." Hugh looked at her steadily. "How far would he come?" "He is the kind of man who does not accept losing," Virginia said. "He will come as far as he has to." This was not a theoretical danger. Hugh knew, better than most, what it meant when a man with money and a grudge turned his attention west. He had seen it before, not precisely this situation, but the shape of it, the architecture of it. A woman alone, a man with resources and no compunction about using them. The law in Perdition Creek was a single deputy named Calvin Moore, who was capable but stretched thin across a territory that would have required 4 men to properly cover. Hugh did not say any of this out loud. He turned it over in his mind while he saddled his horse. "You could stay on at Martha's for a while," he said. "Nobody comes through this town without the whole place knowing in 20 minutes. If anyone asks questions about a woman from Philadelphia, you will know before they finish the conversation." Virginia considered this. "And what would I do here?" she said. It was not a complaint, it was a practical question. "Can you teach?" he said. He was thinking of the school, a single room at the edge of town, currently unstaffed since the previous teacher had left in February to marry a man in Denver. She looked at him. "I just told you I spent 2 years as a school teacher." "Then you can stay," Hugh said. "This town needs a teacher more than it needs most things." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was a practical arrangement offered by a practical man. But standing in the dusty light of the livery stable with the smell of hay and horses around them, and the Colorado mountains framing everything through the open doors like a painting of a place too beautiful to be real, it was also, they would both later agree, the moment the thing between them began. Virginia Brooks started teaching school on the second Monday of September, 1882. There were 11 children enrolled, ranging in age from 6 to 14, with the full variety of background and temperament that a frontier town produced. The school board, which consisted of 3 men who had never been particularly organized about the business, was so grateful to have a teacher at all that they agreed to her terms without much negotiation. A modest salary, a room at Martha's continuing covered by the board, and the authority to manage the classroom as she saw fit. Hugh heard about the first day of school from the Caraway boy, who was 10 and could not keep a secret, and told his father at supper that the new teacher had made them all read out loud and had not laughed at anyone, and had explained fractions using a pie that she had actually baked and brought with her, and which they had eaten at the end of the lesson as a reward for correct answers. Hugh heard this secondhand from Dale Whitmore, who had heard it from Tom Caraway, who relayed it with the expression of a man who has just learned something interesting about a neighbor he had not expected to find interesting. Dale Whitmore was watching Hugh's face while he told the story. "You should ask her to supper," Dale said. "She eats at Martha's," Hugh said. "Somewhere else then," Dale said. "Somewhere you also are." "I'm not going to." Hugh. Dale put down his coffee cup. "You drove past town twice last week on days you had no business being in town. The second time you tied your horse up outside the general store and then didn't go inside for 20 minutes. I know because I was standing in Emmett's window." Hugh looked at his friend for a long moment. "She is in a difficult situation," he said carefully. "She is," Dale agreed. "And you are a man who finds himself thinking about her difficult situation while he is riding a fence line that does not require thinking about." This was accurate. Hugh had been riding that north fence for 11 years and could do it in his sleep, and lately he had been doing it wide awake and distracted, which was new. The thing was, and he would not have admitted this to Dale Whitmore, who would have been insufferable about it, The thing was that Virginia Brooks was unlike anyone he had ever had a sustained conversation with. He had grown up in Colorado, the son of a cattleman who had built something real out of nothing, and he had loved his father and he had learned from him, but his father had been a man of few words and practical silences. His mother had died when Hugh was 14, and after that the house had gotten quieter and stayed quiet. He had grown into a man who was competent and respected and fundamentally solitary, not from bitterness but from habit, the way a person walks through a door that has always been there and does not think to look for another door. Virginia was another door. She spoke about ideas like they were interesting. She had opinions about things that had no practical application whatsoever: the structure of Shakespeare's history plays, the philosophical implications of the railroad, why the color of the mountains changed depending on the time of day, and she expressed them with a directness that did not invite argument so much as it invited response, genuine response, and he found that he had responses, things he had never said out loud to anyone. That seemed to be waiting for exactly this specific kind of invitation. He did ask her to supper, not in the way Dale had suggested, with implications and intent made plain. He asked her in the way that made sense for who he was. He showed up at the school on a Friday afternoon when the children had gone and she was erasing the blackboard, and he said he was going to Hannigan's for supper, and he was asking if she would like to join him because it seemed like the civilized thing to do, and Hannigan's was the best food in town, which was not saying very much but was true. Virginia put down the eraser, looked at him with those dark eyes. Said, "Is Hannigan's establishment also the only one with more than 3 tables?" "Yes," he admitted. "Then I accept," she said, and went to get her coat. Hannigan's was run by an Irishman named Pat Hannigan, who had come west in 1865, and had tried 3 different enterprises before discovering that what a mining and ranching community needed most desperately was a place to eat that was not their own cooking. He did a simple menu beef stew, roasted chicken when available, cornbread, coffee, and on Saturdays a dried apple pie that men planned their week around. And he ran it with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that his customers were not looking for entertainment. They were looking for nourishment, and occasionally for the comfort of sitting at a table with other human beings. Hugh and Virginia sat at the table by the window. The evening light was doing the thing Colorado evenings did in September, turning everything amber and gold and slightly unreal. He ordered the stew. She ordered the chicken because she said she had been eating beef stew at Martha's every 3rd night for 2 weeks, and her appreciation for it had reached its natural limit. They talked for 2 hours. They talked about the ranch. He had been running it alone since his father died 8 years ago. 2,000 acres in the valley below the first rise of the mountains, good grass, reliable water, a herd that had survived 2 hard winters and was now producing steadily. He talked about it the way a person talks about something they love, but have gotten so used to loving that they have almost forgotten to describe it. She asked questions that made him describe it again, from the beginning, as if she were seeing it for the first time. She talked about Philadelphia, not about Aldridge. They had both agreed by unspoken mutual agreement to leave that particular topic at the door, but about the city itself, the way it smelled in summer and the sound of it at night, and the particular quality of life in a place where history had been accumulating for 150 years, where every street had a story that someone had already written down. She said she had loved it and been confined by it in equal measure, and that the confinement had been the more powerful feeling in the end. "Is that why you were going with him?" Hugh asked. He had not meant to ask it, it came out anyway. Virginia looked at her plate for a moment. "Partly," she said. "He offered a way out that seemed to cost less than the alternatives." She looked up. "I was wrong about the cost." He did not say anything comforting. He did not think she wanted comfort. He said, "Most people figure out too late that the easy way and the cheap way are not the same thing." She looked at him with the direct, measuring attention that he had gotten used to but that never entirely failed to make him aware of his own posture. "You are smarter than you let on," she said. "I let on plenty," he said, slightly affronted. "You hide behind the practical," she said, not unkindly, precisely. "You speak in useful things. Here is the boarding house, here is the school, here is Hannigan's with 3 tables, but that is the surface. Underneath there is a man thinking a great deal that he has decided not to say." The accuracy of this description made him look away, out the window, at the darkening street. After a moment he said, "Pot and kettle, Miss Brooks." She smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile fully, without the careful partial containment she usually applied to her expressions. It changed her face completely. It made her look younger and warmer, and, if he was being honest with himself, so beautiful that he had to work slightly harder than usual to look like a man who was simply having an ordinary supper. "Fair," she said. "Pot and kettle." He walked her back to Martha's in the dark, and said good night at the gate, and rode home through the Colorado night with the stars very clear and very close, and a feeling in his chest that was warm and slightly dangerous, like a fire that has been well built and needs watching. The telegram from Philadelphia arrived on a Saturday morning 6 days later. It was addressed to the general store, which had no particular logic except that Emmett Gale had the only telegraph machine in town, so everything came through him. And it was from a name neither Hugh nor Virginia recognized, which was itself a signal, because a name you do not recognize on a telegram to a town where no one knows you means someone has paid for information. Emmett brought it to the school. Virginia read it at her desk with the children absent for the noon hour, and when Hugh found her 20 minutes later she was sitting very still with the telegram in her lap and the look on her face that he now recognized as her version of fear. Not panic, but the complete focused stillness of a person who has identified a real danger and is calculating the response. The telegram said only, "Heading west, 2 weeks." It was unsigned. "Aldridge," she said, when Hugh sat across from her. "You are certain?" "It is his method," she said. "No signature, no specifics, just the knowledge that you know." She folded the telegram precisely along its original lines. "He wants me to run." "Why?" "Because if I run, I am easier to find. He knows how I move, he has watched me plan and prepare. He is betting that a second warning will make me panic and make a mistake." She looked up at Hugh. "He does not know that I am not planning to run." Something in his chest settled into a kind of solidity. "Good," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You are not going to suggest I leave?" "No. Why not?" He thought about how to say what he meant. "Because running into someone else's plan is the worst move you can make," he said. "And because this town is your town now. You have been here 3 weeks and there is not a person on this street who would not notice a stranger asking about you." "A man with enough money does not always need to ask politely," she said. It was a careful warning, not a surrender. "A man with enough money in Philadelphia is a man with ordinary money in Colorado," Hugh said. "Different country out here." He spent that evening at the deputy's office. Calvin Moore was 29 years old and serious about his work in the way that young lawmen in difficult territory had to be serious to survive it. Hugh told him the situation plainly. Calvin listened without interrupting, which Hugh had always respected about him. At the end he said, "This man Aldridge, does he have paper on her? Any legal claim?" "None," Hugh said. "She was engaged to him voluntarily and left voluntarily. She committed no crime." "Then if he comes here looking for her, he is just a man asking questions," Calvin said, "and I can ask him questions right back." He paused. "You are not just here as a concerned citizen. She is a resident of this town," Hugh said carefully. "Hugh." "Calvin." A brief silence. "Does she know?" Calvin said. Hugh picked up his hat from the desk. "Good night, Deputy Moore." Calvin Moore's voice followed him to the door. "I will keep my eyes open." What happened over the following 3 weeks was the slow, complicated, beautiful thing that happens between two people who have both been hurt by a previous trust and are therefore approaching the new one with extreme care, like a bridge they know is good but need to test each plank of before they walk across. Virginia came to the ranch for the first time on a Sunday, at Hugh's invitation, because he had told her he wanted to show her the place, and she had said she would like to see it. He met her at the north gate and brought her in on horseback. She could ride, which he had suspected but not confirmed, and she sat a horse with the easy competence of someone who had learned young and not forgotten. He showed her the herd, the water source, the barn he had built himself in the first year after his father died. He showed her the kitchen garden that had mostly gone to seed because he had started it in a fit of optimism, and then never had the time to maintain it properly. She crouched down at the edge of the kitchen garden and looked at it for a long moment. "I could fix this," she said. "It is not much of a, I mean the soil is good," she said. She picked up a handful and tested it the way he had seen experienced gardeners do, rolling it in her palm and watching how it fell. "You have good drainage and good sun here. What grows at this elevation?" he told her. "Potatoes, beans, onions, some herbs, tomatoes if you were lucky and the summer was long enough." She nodded, still looking at the garden with the focused attention she brought to things she had decided were worth her energy. He watched her. He was aware of watching her. He was aware of the quality of the afternoon light on her hair, and of the way the mountains looked behind her, and of the very specific tenderness that was building in him, that had been building since the platform, that he had been managing and containing with what he was beginning to recognize as considerable effort. "Virginia," he said. She looked up. He had not planned what to say. He had planned, in the broad, abstract way of a man who is not good at this, to let things develop naturally over time. But there were moments when the honest thing was also the only thing, and this was one of them. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want you to know that I am not saying it because of the circumstances or because you needed somewhere to be or for any reason except that it is true." She stood up. She was listening with her whole attention, which was how she listened. "I did not come back to town the morning after you arrived to buy flour," he said. "I came back because I wanted to see you, and I have continued to come back for that reason." He looked at her steadily. "I am telling you this because I think you deserve to know what you are dealing with. I am not pushing for anything. I am just not willing to let it go unsaid while things are complicated." Virginia was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved across the grass. A bird called somewhere up in the mountains. "Hugh," she said, and his name in her mouth sounded different from how it sounded anywhere else. "I left Philadelphia because I trusted someone I should not have trusted, and it nearly cost me everything I valued about my own life." She paused. "I am not saying that to warn you off. I am saying it because it means that I am slower now than I would have been 2 years ago. I need to be sure of what I feel before I say it." "That is fair," he said. "I feel something," she said, directly, carefully, like every important thing she said. "I want you to know that I feel something. I am just not ready to name it yet." He nodded. He felt it too, the thing that had started on the platform and had been growing with every conversation, every supper, every morning she read on the porch and looked up when she heard his boots. He had not known until 3 weeks ago that a person could feel lonely and not feel alone at the same time. He knew it now. "Take the time you need," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and what he saw in her eyes then, not quite a declaration, but the clear, unmistakable presence of something true, was enough. It was more than enough. Robert Aldridge arrived in Perdition Creek on the first Friday of October 1882. Hugh knew it before he saw the man, because 3 people told him within 20 minutes of Aldridge stepping off the eastbound stage. Emmett Gale, who had been standing outside his store and noted the quality of the newcomer's coat. Tom Carraway's wife, who had passed the man in the street and found him notable for looking at everything and everyone with the assessing coldness of someone computing values. And Calvin Moore, who came to find Hugh at the livery stable with the look of a man who has already made his assessment and is sharing it as a professional courtesy. "He came in on the stage with a man I did not recognize," Calvin said. "The second man is not from around here and is wearing a belt rig he does not need for traveling. I am watching them both." "Does she know?" Hugh said. "Martha Holt will have told her approximately 90 seconds after he arrived." Hugh went to the boarding house. Virginia was in her room, which Martha had shown him to once and which he had not gone to since, but today he knocked on the door. She opened it immediately. She was dressed and composed, which meant she had been expecting him. "I know," she said. "Martha told me. What do you want to do?" She looked at him for a moment. He could see in her face the old training in containment, the Philadelphia woman who had learned to manage her reactions in front of difficult men, but he could also see through it now, to the real feeling underneath. She was not frightened. She was furious, and underneath the fury was something that was not quite grief but was adjacent to it, the knowledge that something she had escaped was still trying to reach her. "I want to go about my day," she said. "I want to teach my class, and I want to walk home, and I want to have supper, and I want him to know that I am not hiding and I am not running, and that this is my town." He looked at her. The conviction in her voice was not bravado. It was something much steadier than that. "All right," he said. "I will walk with you." "You don't have to, I know," he said. "I want to." She held his gaze for a moment and then gave a short nod, and something in that small gesture, the way she accepted his support not as rescue but as partnership, made the thing in his chest do something complicated and warm. Aldridge found them on the main street at noon. Hugh had expected it. The man was not subtle about his approach. He came toward them directly, across the street, with the practiced confidence of someone who has never had to second-guess his right to take up space. He was about 40, broad-shouldered, well-dressed in the Eastern City manner, with a face that had probably been handsome once, and had curdled slightly into something that looked like authority but was actually just certainty of his own importance. The man behind him, the one Calvin Moore had mentioned, stayed 20 feet back and to the left. Aldridge stopped in front of Virginia. He did not look at Hugh. "Virginia," he said. His voice was the kind of smooth that comes from years of careful practice. "I have come a very long way." "I know," she said. She did not move, did not shrink. Her voice was perfectly steady. "You have wasted the journey." "That is a cold welcome for the man you agreed to marry," Aldridge said, still smooth, still not looking at Hugh. "I agreed to marry the man I thought you were," Virginia said. "The man I thought you were did not exist, so the agreement is void." Something moved across Aldridge's face, not anger exactly, something colder than anger, calculation. "There are people in Philadelphia who would be very interested in certain things you overheard," he said softly. "You mean my father," she said. "I received word last week that the federal marshal's office in Philadelphia has taken an interest in those same things. I wonder how they heard about it." She paused. "My sister Alina is very capable." The calculation behind Aldridge's eyes shifted. Hugh had been watching the man's face, and he saw the precise moment when Aldridge understood that the thing he had been holding over her had been removed, that the threat had been neutralized before he arrived, and that the long journey west had been for nothing. And then Aldridge looked at Hugh for the first time, a long, measuring look. "And who are you?" he said. "Hugh Lawson," Hugh said. "I own the land that starts where this town ends and goes about 2,000 acres north." He said it quietly and without any particular emphasis, which was more effective than anger. "This is my town." "Virginia is under no one's protection but her own," Aldridge said. It was a probe, looking for a weakness. "That is correct," Virginia said before Hugh could speak. "I am not under anyone's protection. I am a teacher and a resident of this town, and I am standing on a public street, and you are welcome to stand here as long as you like and then get back on the stage when it returns." She looked at him with the clearest, most unafraid gaze Hugh had ever seen. "We are done, Robert. We have been done since the moment I learned who you actually are." Calvin Moore materialized at the edge of the scene, with the instinct of a good lawman for the exact moment when a presence is needed. He did not say anything. He simply stood where he could be seen, with his badge catching the sun. Aldridge looked at Virginia one more time, then at Hugh, then at Calvin Moore. The arithmetic was very clear. He had come to use a threat that no longer existed in a town that did not belong to him against a woman who was not afraid of him. He turned and walked back the way he had come. The man in the belt rig followed him. Hugh watched until they were both around the corner, and then he let out a breath he had not been aware of holding. Virginia turned to him. Her color was slightly higher than usual, and her hands, he noticed, were perfectly still at her sides, a stillness that was control, that was will, and that he found in that moment the most impressive thing he had ever seen. "You were going to say something," she said. "I was going to let you handle it," he said. "Which you did. Which you did not need me for." "No," she said, "but I was glad you were there." They stood on the main street of Perdition Creek, Colorado, in the October noon sun, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and what passed between them in that look was everything that had been building since the platform and could not be put back. He said her name. Just her name. Virginia. She closed the 2 steps between them and kissed him. It was not tentative. Virginia Brooks was not, in any domain, tentative. It was the kind of kiss that is also a declaration, that says, "I have decided and I am certain and I am not afraid of this." His hands came up to hold her face, because he could not do that, and the street of the town went on around them. Emmett Gale definitely saw, because Emmett saw everything, and the 3 people who witnessed it would tell the story differently but with equal enthusiasm, and the mountains stood above everything, as they always did, indifferent and eternal and perfect. They broke apart. Virginia's eyes were open, looking at him. "I named it," she said. "I noticed," he said. "I have been thinking about it," she said, "since the garden, the kitchen garden. When you stood there and I could feel you watching me, and I thought, this is what the real thing feels like. I had forgot." She paused, or perhaps I had never known. He was still holding her face, his thumb along her jaw. He said, "I do not know how to do this slowly." "Neither do I," she said. "But I think we have both established that we can manage the hard things." Robert Aldridge left on the afternoon stage. Calvin Moore confirmed it with the particularity of a man closing a file. Hugh heard about it late in the day from Emmett, who told him with the satisfied air of a town that has dealt with something and wants to acknowledge its own efficiency. The weeks that followed were the weeks that would, looking back, define the rest of both their lives, though neither of them would have described it that way at the time. At the time, they were simply the weeks in which 2 people who had been circling each other for 2 months discovered what it meant to stop circling and move toward. Virginia came to the ranch most Sunday afternoons. She resurrected the kitchen garden, which was not possible for this season, but which she prepared for the next, clearing the weeds, amending the soil with what she could find, mapping out where things would go in the spring. Hugh watched this and found it unexpectedly moving, this act of planning for a future, making something out of a place that had previously been a good idea no one had executed. He began to fix things around the house that he had been living around for years: a loose porch board, a window that stuck, the kitchen stove that had needed adjustment for months. He did these things, and Virginia noticed but did not comment directly, which was its own kind of conversation. They talked every day, in the spaces around their separate work. He told her things he had not told anyone, about his father, about the loneliness of the first years after, about the ranch not as an enterprise but as the thing he had built to fill the space that loneliness had left. She told him things that she had been keeping, about her mother who had died when Virginia was 16, about the choice to become a teacher rather than find a husband immediately in a world that considered the latter more practical, about the part of the Aldridge story she had not told him yet, that she had been afraid, in the weeks before she left Philadelphia, in a way she had not been afraid since her mother died. He listened to this one evening at Martha's supper table after the other boarders had gone, and Martha had tactfully removed herself to the kitchen, and when she finished, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a long time, not talking, in the way that people sit together when words have done their work, and it is time for something else to do its work. He asked her to marry him in November. He did not do it with grand theater. He was not built for grand theater. He did it in the kitchen garden, now dormant for winter, staked and cleared and waiting for spring on a Sunday afternoon when the light was low and golden, and the first cold was coming off the mountains. He told her what he had been thinking, which was this: that he had built the ranch and loved it and that it had not been enough. And now she was here, and she had her school and her work and her life in this town. And he wanted to know if she would also be willing to build it with him, because he believed they could build something better together than either of them could build alone. He said, "I am asking you to marry me, Virginia. I am asking knowing that you do not need me, because you have shown very clearly that you do not need anyone. I am asking because I want to be here. I want to be where you are." She looked at him across the dormant garden with the mountains behind him and the last of the November light in the sky. She said, "Yes, I will." She said it simply and directly, and with the full weight of her commitment behind it, which was how Virginia Brooks did everything, and he felt it land in him like something setting into place, a keystone, the piece that makes everything else stable. They were married in December 1882. The wedding was performed by the circuit preacher, a genuine and earnest man named Reverend Douglas, who came through Perdition Creek every 6 weeks and who performed the ceremony in the town's single church building with the whole population of the town in attendance, because Perdition Creek did not have enough people for anyone to miss a wedding. Martha Holt cried. Dale Whitmore stood beside Hugh and nudged him at the moment Virginia appeared in the doorway in a dress that was not white. She had worn white for the Aldridge engagement, and had decided quite firmly never to do that again, but the deep blue-green of a Colorado mountain lake, which somehow suited her better than white ever could have. The Caraway children were in the front row, and the youngest one, a girl of 6 named Polly, stared at Virginia with the focused adoration of a child who has decided that her teacher is also the most beautiful person she has ever seen. Hugh held Virginia's hands at the altar and looked at her face and thought, "I waited 3 days at a station for someone who did not come, and then the right person came." He thought, "If Clara Hobbs had stepped off that train, I would have been grateful and built a decent life, and I never would have known what I was missing." He did not say this out loud. He stored it in the place where he kept the things he understood deeply but had not yet found words for. Later, much later, he would tell Virginia, and she would look at him with the look she had, the one that said she was seeing him clearly and finding the view worth having, and she would say, "You waited 3 days and I lost everything I thought I wanted. And here we are. Here we were." The winter of 1882 to 1883 was hard. Colorado winters were always hard, but this one came with a particular ferocity in January. A sustained cold that tested every homestead in the valley and required every ounce of the preparation Hugh had spent the fall making. The herd needed tending in conditions that were genuinely dangerous, and there were days when he came in from the barn with his hands white and his face numb, and Virginia would have coffee ready and would not fuss over him, but would simply hand him the cup and sit beside him at the kitchen table while the stove did its work. She had moved into the ranch house as his wife, keeping the school through the arrangement they had negotiated. She would continue teaching through the spring term because the children needed continuity and because she was good at it and loved it, and they would reassess in summer. Martha Holt became her closest friend in the particular way that women of different generations sometimes become friends, based on mutual respect and the recognition of similar qualities expressed differently across a 40-year gap. Virginia transformed the house. Not dramatically, she was not a woman who needed drama to create effect, but steadily and with purpose. A curtain here, a shelf of books there. The kitchen garden planned in full detail on paper through the winter, ready to execute in March. She found in the attic a box of Hugh's mother's things that he had not been able to touch since she died, and she did not open it without asking, but she brought it to him one evening and said, "Tell me about her," and he did, and it was the first time he had talked about his mother at length in 17 years, and afterwards he felt lighter in a way that he had not anticipated and could not entirely explain. He told her about his dark past, about the years after his father died when the ranch had nearly gone under, and he had made decisions he was not proud of, shortcuts that had cost neighbors, and that he had spent years quietly making right. Not dramatic villainy, but the smaller compromises of a young man under pressure who had not yet understood what he was made of. Virginia listened without judgment and without absolution. She did not tell him it was all fine, because she was not that kind of woman, but she said, "You made it right. That is the more important part." The spring of 1883 was extraordinary. Virginia's kitchen garden went in March, and was producing by June with a vigor that surprised even her. The good Colorado soil doing what it had always been capable of, with someone willing to give it proper attention. The first tomatoes were an event. She brought one inside and sliced it at the kitchen table, and they ate it with salt and nothing else, in the way that the first garden tomato of the year always deserves to be eaten. And he looked at her face, and she looked at him, and both of them were smiling for no complicated reason at all. The school continued. In the spring term, she had added 2 new students, the children of a family that had settled 6 miles north, and she had convinced the school board to allocate funds for a second reading primer, which was a small victory she described to Hugh at supper with the particular satisfaction of a person who fights small battles with their full attention. She was pregnant by May. She told him on a morning when the garden was beginning to come in properly, standing in the kitchen with the light coming through the new curtain she had put up in January blue-checked cotton, a small thing that had changed the whole feeling of the room, and she told him plainly and directly, watching his face. His face did what it did when something went very deep, very fast. It went still, and then something moved across it that was not exactly any single identifiable expression, but was clearly enormous. And then he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her, carefully, as if she were something very valuable that also had opinions about being handled. "Hugh," she said into his shoulder. "Yes," he said, "I'm not fragile." "I know," he said. He held her more normally, which was to say, firmly and close and not letting go. "I know you are not." The baby was born in December 1883, on the first anniversary of their wedding to within 3 days, which was the kind of timing that felt deliberate even though it was not. It was a boy. They named him John Daniel Lawson, John for Hugh's father and Daniel for Virginia's. Reverend Douglas performed the baptism at the church on a cold January morning with the whole town in attendance again, because Perdition Creek did not need much reason to gather, and a baby was the best kind of reason. John Daniel Lawson was a red-faced, loud, opinionated child from his first hours, which Martha Holt said meant he had his mother's disposition and his father's stubbornness, and which Hugh and Virginia both accepted as entirely accurate. Virginia stopped teaching in January, as the baby required her full attention, but by March she had negotiated an arrangement with the school board to return in the fall, when John would be old enough for Martha to mind during school hours. Martha, who had declared herself the child's honorary grandmother with the cheerful authority of a woman who is not asking permission. The school board, now deeply aware of what they had in Virginia Brooks Lawson, agreed without negotiation. The years that came after were built on that foundation. Hugh expanded the ranch steadily, adding a second herd of horses in 1884 and developing a reputation for well-broke stock that brought buyers from 3 counties. He hired 2 cowhands, young men named Pete Ortega and Frank Sellers, who were good workers and whom he paid fairly, which was not as universal a practice as it should have been in the cattle country of Colorado in the 1880s. Pete Ortega was from a Mexican family whose land had been taken in the territorial adjustments of previous decades, and Hugh was aware of that history and aware of the injustice in it, and he paid Pete a wage that reflected what his work was worth rather than what the market said a man of his background could be expected to accept. Virginia, when she knew this, looked at her husband with the expression that meant she was proud of him, but was not going to say it in a way that embarrassed him. In 1885 they had their second child, another boy, James Henry, as loud and opinionated as his brother, who had by this time developed the particular tyranny of a 2-year-old convinced he is the center of the known universe. The house, which had been built for one person and had been comfortable for two, now felt appropriately populated. Virginia taught school until 1887, when she reluctantly handed the classroom to a new teacher, a young woman named Miss Petra Vance, who had come out from Ohio, and who Virginia assessed over 2 weeks of careful observation and declared capable and committed, which was the highest praise she offered professionally. She continued to advise Petra through the school board and maintained her own curriculum opinions with an authority that the board had learned, after 5 years, to receive as the gift it was. There were difficulties. There were always difficulties. A bad year for cattle in 1886 that thinned the margins and required hard decisions. A winter illness in 1887 that took John down for 3 frightening weeks before he fought his way back to his noisy self. A night in 1885 when a fire started in the south barn from a kicked-over lantern and Hugh ran to fight it, and Virginia stood outside with the 2 children and watched the flames and kept herself steady through the sheer force of her will, until Hugh came back with Pete and Frank having saved the horses and contained the fire to the structure. He found her sitting on the fence with James on her hip and John beside her, her jaw set and her face white and her eyes showing what the controlled posture was designed to contain. He went to her and she handed him James and put her head on his shoulder, just for a moment, and then straightened. "The horses are all out," she said. "Every one," he said. "Good," she said, and then, "I think I need to sit down." They rebuilt the south barn that autumn. Virginia designed the new layout with a second door and a better ventilation plan, which Pete and Frank and Hugh built to her specifications, and which was, they all privately agreed, better than the original. In 1888, when John was 4 and James was 3, Virginia discovered she was pregnant again. She told Hugh in the kitchen garden, which by this point was a substantial operation, 4 raised beds, 2 herb sections, a small greenhouse structure Hugh had built the previous winter, and she said it with the same directness as the first time but with less of the watching of his face, because they were past the stage where she needed to watch his face for signs of how he felt. She knew how he felt. She felt the same way. A girl this time. They named her Margaret Helen for both grandmothers. She was a quieter baby than her brothers, with dark auburn hair that was clearly her mother's and the steady, assessing eyes of a child who is watching everything and has opinions she has not yet developed the vocabulary to express. Virginia looked at her daughter's face and laughed, the full laugh that she had, generous and unguarded, and said, "Hugh, she is going to be trouble." "She is going to be perfect," Hugh said. "Both," Virginia said. "Both can be true." By 1890, Hugh Lawson was 39 years old and Virginia was 32, and they had been married for 8 years, and the ranch was one of the most productive operations in the county. The house had been extended twice, a proper second bedroom built in 1885 and a proper parlor in 1888, with enough space now for the 3 children and the life they had built together. The kitchen garden had expanded into a proper kitchen garden, and a small orchard of apple and plum trees that would begin producing seriously in another few years. The town of Perdition Creek had grown as well, 200 people by 1890, a proper hotel where Martha Holt's boarding house had once been the only option, a second general store, and the beginnings of a school board that was actually organized rather than just 3 men making hopeful decisions. Virginia was on that board in an unofficial capacity, because the territory did not yet formally permit it, but her influence was felt in every decision, and when the territory changed its rules in 1893, she accepted the formal appointment with the calm of a woman who has been doing the job for years, and is simply receiving the title that should have been hers all along. Calvin Moore was still the deputy. He had been offered the marshal's position twice and had turned it down both times, because he preferred this town and these people over any promotion, and because He had married a woman named Rose Watkins in 1885 and had no desire to uproot them both. He and Hugh played chess on Friday evenings at Hannigan's, which was still open, still run by Pat Hannigan, still producing the best dried apple pie in the county on Saturdays. Hugh and Virginia had a fourth child in 1892. Another boy, Thomas Robert Lawson, named for the combination of family names that had not yet been used. Thomas was born in the spring, when the apple and plum trees were beginning their first serious bloom, and Virginia had spent the last weeks of her pregnancy walking in the new orchard every morning, and Hugh had walked with her, the way he walked everywhere with her, not in front and not behind but beside her. Their life by the middle of the 1890s was a life that had been built deliberately, brick by brick, out of the careful labor of two people who knew the difference between what life looked like from the outside and what it felt like from the inside. From the outside, a successful cattle ranch, a solid house, 4 healthy children, standing in the community, a respected name. These things were true, and Hugh was proud of them in the way a man should be proud of work honestly done. From the inside, the kitchen table in the morning with coffee and the particular quality of light that came through those blue-checked curtains, replaced twice but always the same color, and Virginia reading aloud from whatever book she was currently considering important while he read the stock reports from the Denver paper, and the sound of the children still sleeping in their rooms, and the way the day had not yet made any demands of them, and the morning was simply theirs. The Sunday afternoons in the garden. The evenings when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and they sat on the porch together, watching the stars come out over the mountains in that particular Colorado darkness that felt like the most private place in the world. The way she still looked at him sometimes, with the clear, direct, fully invested attention that had caught him on the platform at Perdition Creek Station in 1882, and had never, in the years since, failed to make him aware of his own posture. The way he still showed up. Not as a rescuer, she had never needed rescuing, and they had both known it from the beginning, but as a presence, steady, deliberate, consistent. The man who came back not because she needed him to, but because he wanted to be where she was. There was a conversation they had in 1895 that Hugh would remember for the rest of his life. John was 11, James was 10, Margaret was 7, Thomas was 3. The apple trees were producing properly now, and Virginia had made applesauce and apple preserves all through the fall with an industry that had filled the cellar shelves, and which she surveyed with the satisfaction of a general reviewing a well-run campaign. They were sitting on the porch in the November evening, with the children inside and the mountains dark against a sky full of stars, and Virginia said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Clara Hobbs had come?" He looked at her. "Sometimes. And I think I would have been decent to her and worked hard and built a good life," he said. "And I think I would have been lonely in a way I would never have been able to name because I would not have had anything to compare it to." Virginia was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. "I think about Robert Aldrich sometimes," she said. "I think about the woman I was in Philadelphia who was planning a wedding and telling herself it was enough." She paused. She was so tired. She did not know it yet, but she was so tired. "And now," Hugh said. She turned and looked at him with those dark, direct eyes that had not changed, not in 13 years, not in the ways that mattered. "Now I am not tired at all," she said. "I am the least tired I have ever been in my life." He took her hand. She held his. The night was very quiet, and the mountains were very dark, and the stars were very clear and very close, the way they always were in Colorado if you got far enough from the town lights, and the house behind them was full of the particular sounds of a house with children in it, and everything he had built and everything she had brought to it, and everything they had made together was present in that moment, complete and real and good. He had waited 3 days at a station for a woman who did not come. And then Virginia Brooks had stepped off the train with a worn leather satchel and no plan and eyes that cut straight through him, and she had changed him. Not into someone unrecognizable, not in the way that stories sometimes describe transformation, like a man swapped out for a different man. but in the deeper, truer way. She had shown him the rest of himself. The parts that had been there all along, waiting for the right conditions. The part that could say what it felt instead of managing it in silence. The part that could plan an orchard because someone had taught him to believe in a future past the immediate. The part that could hold a daughter and say, "She is going to be perfect," and mean it without reservation. Virginia had changed Hugh Lawson by being exactly who she was, fully and without apology, in a town where she had arrived with nothing and built everything. And Hugh had changed Virginia by staying. By coming back to the station the next morning not with Flower but with himself. By being the first person, since the world had made her learn to hide the real weight of things, who looked at the real weight of things and did not flinch. In 1897, Hugh built Virginia a proper study. A room of her own off the parlor, south-facing, with good light and the view of the kitchen garden from the window and 2 full walls of shelves, for the books that had been gradually colonizing every horizontal surface in the house. He built it himself, the way he built everything important, with Pete Ortega's help and James helping on weekends now that James was 15 and useful, and with John, at 16, supervising in the way of eldest children who have decided they are adults. Virginia stood in the doorway of the finished room on a Saturday morning in October with the autumn light coming through the south window, and she looked at the shelves and the desk he had made for her, solid oak, the right height, with a drawer that locked because she had mentioned once that she liked the idea of a drawer that locked, and she said nothing for a long moment. Hugh stood behind her and waited. "Hugh," she said. "Yes. This is the most beautiful room I have ever been in." He looked at the room. It was a good room. Well built, well lit, honest in its materials and construction, not ornate, not intended to impress. Intended to be exactly what she needed, built to exactly her specifications as he had extracted them over months of careful attention to what she mentioned wanting. "Good," he said. She turned and kissed him with the same full conviction that she had brought to the first kiss on the main street of Perdition Creek in 1882. And he held her with the same sureness he had held her with every time since. And John and James were somewhere outside making noise that indicated a minor dispute about fence posts. And Margaret was reading in the parlor with the contained intensity of a 7-year-old who has learned from her mother's example that books are serious business. And Thomas was in the kitchen with the small chaos of a 5-year-old. And the house was full of all of it. All the fullness and noise and life of everything they had made. Later that afternoon, when the room had been admired by the children and Margaret had claimed the window seat as her personal reading territory, which Virginia permitted on the condition that Margaret's own books be kept on her own shelves, they sat together on the porch again in the fall evening. "Do you remember," Virginia said, "the day you showed me the kitchen garden, the first time?" "Yes," he said. "I knew then," she said. "I told you I named it later, but I knew then." She looked at him. "I was not ready to admit it, but I knew." He thought about that day, her crouching at the edge of the gone-to-seed garden, picking up soil, planning for a future. The way she had looked up at him when he said her name, the thing he had seen in her eyes that he had carried all the way home and all the way through the months after, the thing that had been enough. "So did I," he said. "From the platform, honestly." She raised an eyebrow. "From the platform, you had known me for 40 seconds. You walked across the platform like you owned it," he said. "You had just stepped off a train in a town you had never been to with nowhere to go, and you walked like you owned it. I thought, that is the most remarkable person I have ever seen." Virginia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the small, precise humor that had been making him smile for 15 years, "And yet you told me you were waiting for someone else." "I was," he said. "I was just immediately aware that I had been waiting for the wrong person." She laughed the full laugh, unguarded, and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and the October evening went on in its unhurried Colorado way, and the mountains were dark and close, and the stars were beginning to come out, and everything was exactly as it should be. He had waited 3 days at the station. The woman who had finally stepped off had not been the one he expected. She had been something so much better. She had been Virginia Brooks, who was nobody's answer to a letter, who was no one's arrangement or plan, who had arrived in his town with a battered satchel, and a story she was still writing and eyes that saw through every practical surface to the actual human being underneath. She had been the woman who taught him that the real thing was not the thing you arranged for, but the thing you were willing to recognize when it arrived, unexpected and unplanned, on a Tuesday afternoon in September 1882, stepping off a train and looking up and down the platform with the sharp, focused attention of someone who needed to know where the exits were. And he had recognized her, and she had recognized him, and everything after that had been the work of two people building a life they had both been waiting for without knowing they were waiting, two people who had arrived at the same place by different roads and had looked at each other and said, "Here, this, you." Thomas Lawson grew up to be a quiet and thoughtful boy who reminded everyone of his father in the best ways, and who at 7 announced with complete conviction that he intended to be a doctor, which Virginia received with the expression of a woman who was not even slightly surprised. John at 18 went to Denver to study, the first Lawson to go beyond a territory school, and came home for every Christmas with the particular combination of a young man who has grown and a young man who is still entirely himself. James took up ranching with the seriousness of someone who has understood from birth that the land is the thing, and at 17 he could already read cattle and weather, and terrain the way his father did, instinctively and completely. Margaret at 9 had Virginia's directness and her father's patience, which was an unusual and powerful combination that teachers and neighbors noted with something between admiration and mild alarm. She read everything she could find and demanded explanations for things that most adults preferred not to explain to children, and Virginia gave her the explanations, every one, with the conviction that a child who wants to know deserves to be told. Hugh turned 48 in 1899, and Virginia turned 40 in the same year, and they celebrated both birthdays with a supper at the ranch. Now expanded again, a proper large table in the dining room that Martha Holt had suggested, and Virginia had agreed would be needed eventually. With the children and Dale Whitmore and his wife and Calvin Moore and Rose, and Pat Hannigan from the restaurant and Petra Vance from the school, and half a dozen other people who had been woven into their life over 17 years. Hugh stood at the head of his table and looked down its length at his wife and his children and his friends, and at the house they had built and the life it contained, and he felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has done what he set out to do and finds it is even better than he imagined, because he could not have imagined this. He had not had the right materials for the imagining, back in the beginning, before Virginia. He caught Virginia's eye across the table. She was talking to Martha, but she looked at him, and what she said with that look was the same thing she had been saying with it for 17 years, ever since the platform, ever since the kitchen garden, ever since the main street and the kiss. "I see you. I choose this. I am here." He raised his glass. She smiled. The evening went on, warm and full, in the house that had been built for one and had grown to hold everything. Outside, the Colorado night was clear and cold and full of stars. The mountains stood in their patient, permanent way, as they had always stood, as they would always stand over the station where a man had waited 3 days, over the street where a woman had walked with her worn satchel and changed everything, over the kitchen garden and the new orchard and the south-facing study with its locked drawer and 2 walls of books, over the whole accumulated life of Hugh and Virginia Lawson, which was the real thing, the true thing, the thing that had arrived unexpected and stayed forever.